Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon when the College of Science is hosting a special event on International Women's Day, and we welcome to our campus Dr. Mary Gray. I'll tell you a little bit about Dr. Gray. Mary Wheat Gray is a distinguished professor of mathematics and statistics at the American University in Washington, D.C. She is the author of more than 175 books, chapters, and journal articles in statistics, mathematics, economics, education, and the law. She has a PhD in mathematics from the University of Kansas and a JD from Washington School of Law. Dr. Gray is a fellow of the American Mathematical Society, the American Statistical Association, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the Association for Women in Mathematics, of which she was a founder and the founding president. Dr. Gray has received numerous awards for her outstanding contributions in teaching, mentoring, and her fight for social justice, including the United States Presidential Award for Excellence in Science, Mathematics, and Engineering Mentoring. She also received mentoring awards for many other national and international organizations. In its 50th anniversary, the Association for Women in Mathematics recently established the Mary and Alfie Gray Award for the use of mathematics for social justice. Professor Gray served for many years as International Treasurer of Amnesty International, as a chair of the board of directors of the American Middle East Education Foundation. She has worked on statistical and human rights issues in Iraq, Syria, Myanmar, Rwanda, Panama, and Sudan, just to name a few, as well as in civil litigation in the United States. We are very happy that Dr. Gray was able to join us today, and it is now my honor and privilege to welcome to our presentation, do our presentation now, this amazing woman, role model, mentor, and someone I am very happy to call my friend, Dr. Mary Gray.
So human rights, yesterday, today, and always. That's one of my motto. The reason I say this is because International Women's Day is not celebrated very much throughout the United States, more so in Europe and other places. The only other celebration I've ever been at for International Women's Day was in Eritrea in 1993. So as you see, that was some time ago. That was just at the time that Eritrea was becoming independent, having previously been a part of Ethiopia. And the parade that was the feature of International Women's Day in Asmara, Eritrea, was featured by tanks being driven by the women who were responsible for winning the independence of Eritrea. So it was a very moving parade and ceremony that followed. Now, unfortunately, an ex-student of mine who was teaching at the university there had invited me to come for this. Unfortunately, he's now once again in exile. He was at American getting his PhD in the first place, and now he's back in exile, and the government of Eritrea is in not very good shape, I'm sad to say. Afghanistan, you know about the ongoing problems of human rights in Afghanistan. The picture of Iraq is Iraq in 2005, when we were pretty optimistic about Iraq. After we had managed to invade it and destroy a lot of stuff, we had established a system for electoral progress. We thought it was famous at the time because you got a purple finger whenever you voted. And this is a poster about the voting there. Again, Iraq comes and goes. 2005, as I say, was one of the more optimistic times. And then just so we don't forget that we've had our problems in the United States from time to time, the picture down in the corner is from California. It's the grape workers. in the Central Valley of California, which is another project that I was interested in back in 1966, which seems like a long time ago. And of course, then we have the tragedy that's currently occurring in Iraq. One of my colleagues in the Mathematics Statistics Department at Americans' Parents have recently just been evacuated from Kharkov. She's here in the United States, but so many people aren't. So what can we do about the human rights problems everywhere? I've had a long career of fighting about this, that, and the other thing, not actually with weapons that physically I could shoot people. But my first job as a mathematics professor, I was asked to pour the tea at the department colloquium. I suggested that perhaps it would be a good idea if one of my colleagues poured the tea for once, just because it was always a woman, didn't seem right to me. Well, that probably didn't make me enormously popular with my colleagues, because when it came time for me to be promoted from assistant professor to associate professor, the chair of the department managed to remove all the record of my publications from my file before it was sent forward. However, I didn't give up easily. I managed to fight that. I got promoted. The president of the university got fired, so it led me to believe that occasionally you might win. And in any case, even that job was better than my first day in graduate school, when I was told that I had a fellowship that really should have been held by a man. So keep battling. Some of them are pretty small causes, just a promotion, just getting the best grade in the class because he told me I didn't belong there. But sometimes there are bigger issues in which we can all play a role. And the picture, besides the pouring tea is important to statisticians, because one of the early experiences that we always read about probability is in a little book called Ladies Testing Tea, and I recommend it to any of you who are students of statistics, and you'll learn about ladies pouring tea. The other picture that you see now is some workers at American University. Like many employers, large corporations, they have fairly good benefits for their employees. I have health benefits, I have various other kinds of benefits, but the cleaning in the university and the serving of food is done by people who are not actually university employees. It's outsourced because it's cheaper, because the people who do these kind of jobs don't have the same benefits that employees of my university have. I would ask you to look at your own situation, although public universities are usually better at that than private universities, all of whom do things like this. So we were running a campaign for the workers at my university. What we were asking for in particular, for the sons and daughters of these people to be able to get free tuition at American University, just as I, as a faculty member, could get for my children. And that was a big battle. The tuition was over $50,000, which was more than most of the people were being paid. And we did manage to get a policy in so that these employees now have the same benefit as the ones who are actually employees of the university. So even though outsourced, their children can get free tuition at the university. That's today, because we still have to worry about benefits of people who are outsourced in various places and who are not getting the benefits that we would have all learned to expect. But my first serious human rights work actually resulted from my working to help deliver supplies to the Central Valley farm workers. I was working on the Alameda County, which is Oakland, California, labor council at the time, and we needed to have people to drive supplies out to the Central Valley. The Labor Council didn't have the Teamsters Union as part of it, so there weren't a lot of truck drivers around. But luckily, my father had taught me how to drive a truck, so I was able to help deliver supplies to the workers. And as I say, I didn't have to pour tea. We didn't only drank coffee in Nebraska anyway, but I didn't eat grapes for a very long time. Every time I would go into a grocery store, I would ask the produce manager, where did these grapes come from? If they came from the Central Valley of California, I didn't buy, and I would stick a little poster on them saying, don't buy grapes. Fortunately, they weren't wine grapes. You could still buy wine. In any event, I'm not entitled this, the lamented and unlamented past. With the new Apple 13, nice phone, really nice phone. However, it doesn't have the battery life of a BlackBerry. Very few of you looking across the audience ever remember a BlackBerry. It was notorious as the last two people in Washington who used it apparently were President Obama and me, but eventually the university made me stop because they couldn't support it. I don't know whether he managed to keep it or not. In any case, we haven't improved battery life, whatever else we have done. But you see the other picture there is what the computer used to be like what I have now sitting on my desk. It was a room in the university like this. That was fun because we had a president of a board of trustees one day who said, where is the university spending all this money buying computers? We just spent $1 million buying a new computer. This was for a central facility, of course. And so he said, what do these computers, this was a bishop of the local Methodist church who was serving as the chair of the board of trustees. So he said he wanted to see the computers. So we called up the information tech people, got them to turn on everything. So all of the tapes were whirling like this. Output was streaming all over the place. And then he could see where he got his $1 million. And in every budget from then on, the computer department got more money than anybody else. So we've got, the size has gotten smaller, but our influence over controlling where the money goes has probably gotten less. Lots of people say to me, have things got better? I just talked a little earlier this afternoon to a lot of graduate students here at the University of Texas, Arlington. And the question is, how do they see their future? I think how they should see their future in the next few years is probably pretty good. The one thing that I've noticed about women in science particularly, but also in other fields, is that it's a lot easier to get their first job out of school than it used to be. Unfortunately, however, the glass ceiling that sticks above us is only cracked. We haven't broken through it. Not only have we not had a US president, but we've had very few presidents of corporations. We have very, very few presidents of universities. The glass ceiling is still around there. There's still gender bias. We still use all sorts of biased ways to evaluate people. For example, those of you who are students are often asked to participate in evaluations of teaching. You're asked how well your teacher did. The teacher asks how well you do. You're asked how well the teachers do. There are lots of statistics showing that these evaluations have a lot of gender bias, but they're used to decide who to hire, whom to fire, whom to promote in academia, even though they have a biased basis. They also have, I should tell you, a statistically invalid procedure of using categorical variables as if it was okay to compute means. So those of you who are worried about statistics have another reason to know why these shouldn't be used. Well, many jobs in academia have changed even before the pandemic. For example, with all of the pretend emphasis on teaching, people who teach in the universities, who are responsible for education, particularly in undergraduate education, are now serving in all kinds of insecure positions, which affects the education that they're delivering. And unfortunately, these insecure positions, what we refer to as non-tenure track positions, are held disproportionately by women. For example, in my own department at American University, more than 50% of the non-tenure track people are women. The people with the jobs that are underpaid and have heavy teaching loads, the jobs that are not so good. More than 50% of those are women. But with respect to the ones who have more secure jobs, it's only 29%. Now, actually, the 29% is pretty good. If you go on looking at most universities around the country, and I ask you to look at your own, easy enough to know, how well are you doing in a math department, or how well are you doing in whatever department you happen to teach in? Well, talk is easy. Doing something is hard. I spent 4 years in Berkeley, and there was plenty of activity in Berkeley at the time. You see a free speech sign here. It seemed like the sun in Berkeley never came up until noon, but nonetheless, a lot went on. There was a Black Panthers event for the math department at Berkeley. It was a little scary because there were lots of guns around, but there were good breakfast programs for the kids. The meetings and math meetings during this period of time looked like those that are on the right. They're all men. white men, whereas the other picture, which is on the left, looks like we like to have them now. There's lots of diversity. So if you ask for diversity, you can actually get it. It's easy to talk, but it's hard to work to develop the job opportunities that we need for everybody. I went to a math society meeting when I was a young mathematician, and I was told that the organization was run by a consul of the American Math Society. So I thought I'd go along and see what was going on at the meeting of the Math Society consul. And when I got to the door, the president of the council said to me, "Oh, I'm sorry, this meeting is closed. Only members may come in." And I said, no, I read the bylaws. The bylaws said anybody who's a member of the society can come in. So then the president said to me, "Well, it's a gentleman's agreement that only members can come." So then I used the phrase that people remembered for years, "I'm not a gentleman." And I went ahead and went to the meeting. So that was sort of another early experience with me in activism. But I kind of decided at one stage that maybe the American Mathematical Society, like any established professional society at the time, we're talking about the 70s now, these organizations were maybe hopeless. For instance, at another meeting at the council, actually, when I became a member and was the vice president, I proposed that we should have what we call blind refereeing in papers. So those of you who work in research know that it's very important to get your work published. And to appear in a reputable journal, it has to be refereed by somebody. And the notion is that you will then have a check that only good papers will be published. Now the problem is, if you're refereeing a paper by a buddy of yours, a friend of yours, you might have a different opinion than otherwise. So wouldn't it be a good idea to conceal who's writing the paper and who is evaluating it until you decide whether or not it's to be published? And that's called blind refereeing. And when I asked at the meeting of the council, why don't we have blind refereeing, I was told, if we didn't know who wrote the paper, how would we know it's any good? Well, I tell you, that was a long time ago. That was back in the 1990s. Just this year, the American Math Society decided, yep, we're right. Blind refereeing is a good idea. So that's one of the small causes that I talked about, and it's one of the ones that succeeded, like a lot didn't, but it took a very long time. So I thought I should go off and start my own organization if the American Math Society was going to take 40 years to pass very modern reforms. So I started the Association for Women in Math, and we've been around for 50 years now. The reason I formed that organization is because much as I like to fight, I didn't think I could do it on my own. And I was trained as a very abstract mathematician, switched over to do some statistics because it seemed to me I had a better chance of saving the world. Still haven't saved the world, but at least I have some hope. But I decided to form an organization, and as Justice Ginsburg once said, fight for things you think about, but in a way that will lead others to join you. So form an organization, get to people to come along and work with you. But one of the things we'll notice is that it took a long time for the AMS to come up with blind refereeing, but we still haven't come up with an equal rights amendment. I talked to you about not eating grapes for many years. For many years, I didn't eat dinner in Virginia, which is right across the river from my institution, because Virginia had not passed the Equal Rights Amendment. Well, now they've passed the Equal Rights Amendment, and unfortunately, it's like 20 years after the deadline. Before taking on the whole world, I thought maybe social justice really ought to begin at home. So I looked at the retirement benefits that were listed as accruing from my work, only to learn that a man who retired at the same age as I, with the same accumulation of funds, would get 15% more in money per month than I. To my indignant complaint that this was discrimination, and discrimination in employment benefits was, even at that time, back in the 1970s and 80s, was illegal. On the other hand, the insurance company said, no, we don't discriminate on the basis of gender, we discriminate on the basis of longevity. And you all know that women live longer than men. So I asked the insurance company if they were going to guarantee me a longer life than all my male colleagues. They allowed us how maybe I just didn't understand statistics. Well, I dug out a bunch of statistics relevant to why men live longer, don't live as long as we do. It's what's known as longevity, but it's not a legal basis for discrimination. And the longer life for men is caused in large extent by more drinking, more smoking, and more violence. In any case, we eventually won this case, but along the way, when we were having a conference with the lawyers, those of us who were doing the statistics and the lawyers for the side of the woman who was challenging it, were meeting with the lawyers from the insurance company. The lawyers from the insurance company said to me, well, maybe you do understand statistics, but you certainly don't understand the law. So that's when I decided I'd go to law school. So I did. And pretty soon I got at least as good of understanding of the law as they had, because when this case involving the employment benefits got to the Supreme Court, I was able to write a brief as a lawyer, as well as doing the statistics that's involved. And I love this particular case. As I say, we don't get many victories, so we remember the victories. And I got the results of this, of the Supreme Court, which hands out many of its decisions in June, when I was in London. So I ran over to a payphone in Waterloo Station to call up back to Washington to see what the Supreme Court had done. And sure enough, they declared that discrimination as such as had been occurring was illegal. So by that time, I'd finished law school, but I loved law so much that I continued to work in the law at the same time as working in statistics. And so now that's what I do. And I still haven't retired because my university is changing around requirements once again, so I'm sticking with it. So you might not think that equality in pension benefits is a human right. In fact, you might not even think that having a job is a human right, much as we think it's nice to have a job. However, even though it doesn't say in the US Constitution anywhere that we're entitled to a job, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it does say that we're entitled to a job. So what rights do we have? If we're going to talk about statistics and human rights, we ought to know what rights we're talking about. I optimistically think we know about statistics, so this is not the statistics lecture. You can always invite me back if you want to hear about statistics. I'm talking mainly about human rights today. So, some focus on the basic necessities of life, safety, food, shelter. Other people think of human rights as more inclusive, more amorphous. Human rights are really desirable for the most part, but not very clearly defined. Most people express some sort of belief in at least some human rights for some people, although I should mention that once when I was serving on a committee on human rights for a scientific society, and the president appointed a certain person to that committee whose record was questionable at best. So I asked the president, and he said, well, we have to have somebody against human rights on the committee as well as somebody for human rights on the committee. So that didn't seem like much for me. On the other hand, I'm chairing this committee again on human rights of mathematicians. That speaks badly in a sense for my profession. I need more volunteers who can chair the committee for a change. In the US, as I said, we don't declare jobs are a human right, but we tend to identify our human rights as those whose protection is enshrined in the Constitution. On the other hand, the Constitution is not bedtime reading for most of us, so we're not really sure what's there, and we're certainly not sure exactly how these rights are protected. From the First Amendment, we get freedom from the establishment of religion, freedom of press, freedom of assembly. From the Second Amendment, we get the right to keep and bear arms. From the Third through the Eighth Amendments, they protect rights that we usually think of in a criminal justice context. Freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, freedom from self-incrimination, speedy trial with an impartial jury, a right to counsel, the right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. Now, the interesting part about all of these rights is statistics play a role. For example, how do you show that something is cruel and unusual? How do you establish that the jury was established in an impartial fashion? How do you test whether or not you have a speedy trial? How do you test, in fact, the entire lack of bias in the justice system without the use of statistics? Now, Some people think the First Amendment means we can put anything we want to say on Facebook, even pseudoscience. All sorts of junk comes on Facebook under the guise of being science. Or does the Bill of Rights mean that state legislatures, like maybe Texas, are allowed to keep books by Toni Morrison out of the schools? The Second Amendment, does that mean that I can come into class? If I'm a little worried about whether or not you're paying attention, could I wave my gun around? Or does it mean somebody can come in with a loaded gun and wave it around to be sure that we're all enjoying a talk about human rights and statistics? This constitutional protection of persons, houses, papers, and effect extend to our phone calls. Anybody who thinks that he or she can have private phone calls is probably badly mistaken. So many view the Constitution really as a bulwark of protection, but a lot of people currently see the Constitution and the human rights that go with it as currently under some serious challenge. Okay, so we talked about the Constitution. There are additional rights that are guaranteed by other amendments. We have other laws in the United States. We have state and federal laws other than the Bill of Rights, but there are a couple of more amendments to the Constitution that I want to mention. The Constitution came out in late 18th century, of course. It's been around a long time, and in that period of time there have been some amendments, some good, some not so good. The 13th Amendment guaranteed the right not to be enslaved. The 14th, the right of equal protection. Well, except for women, whose equal protection it took until the 20th century to adopt the right to vote for women, and we still don't have the Equal Rights Amendment for all rights being the same. The 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment are the rights to vote. The 15th was for other people. The 19th was for women. We use statistics in all sorts of ways to verify that the voting in elections was reported correctly. We know about that currently. And to verify whether or not the elections were administered fairly, as well as to determine who gets to vote. I like to have my students in statistics classes do projects. If I can find something that's in the line of human justice, that's even better. But one of the projects done by my students, of which I'm especially proud, evaluated the effect of ID requirements on voter participation in Virginia. As I mentioned, Virginia is right across the river from American University. So ID requirements, meaning what did you have to show in order to be able to vote? Well, at the time that we were conducting the survey, you had to have a form of ID which was hard for a lot of people to get. Birth certificates are a relatively recent phenomenon, believe it or not. A lot of older voters didn't have those. They refused to accept student registrations at the time of the survey as legitimate for voting. But what we found out by doing the survey, so elementary statistics classes went out to the polls on election day to find out who didn't get to vote. And they asked just a few questions. So did you come here to vote? And did you get to vote? And if not, why not? Well, it turned out that of the people who were denied the right to vote on the basis of not having proper ID, they were virtually all minority, low-income potential voters. They weren't actually voters. Now, that did get the ID laws in Virginia changed slightly. Now it's slightly easier to vote. It may swing back the other way. But it doesn't, of course, cover the issue of those who don't show up at the polls. You can only be turned away for not having proper ID if you show up at the polls in the first place. So the next year we sent out students on a project to find out what kind of people didn't even go out to vote at all because they were afraid they would be turned away. We haven't solved that problem. The current legislation before Congress is not going to solve that problem, but it's something on which you can all work. You can all go out in the community and find out who's voting, who's not voting, and try to improve the voter turnout. You should be voting as well as helping other people to vote. Oh, another thing you can do is do congressional districts. So you see here a true gerrymandered district. You may have heard recently about a lot of work that's done in redistricting, and a lot of the work is done by mathematicians and statisticians to find out how you can determine where people vote and for whom. So for example, in the state of Maryland, I don't even take on Texas, let's just talk about Maryland. There are 8 representatives to Congress, and so you need to split up the state of Maryland in a way to give fair, equal representation for these 8 people to vote for. Well, in past legislatures have redivided the state of Maryland in various ways in order to increase participation of either Democrats or Republicans in either the traditional Republican part or in the traditional Democratic part. So in other words, they've gerrymandered the districts. They've created them to get more Republicans, more Democrats, more minorities, less minorities, what have you. This happens to be one in North Carolina because it's even more, as you see, strange looking than the way the state of Maryland did it. It's called gerrymander after a judge in Massachusetts a long time ago named Jerry. So gerrymandered districts. There's some legislation that would reduce the potentiality of this to be unfair, but so far it's not getting very far in Congress. Some of the other rights that I mentioned jump out as needing statistical evidence. For example, is the death penalty cruel and unusual? How are you going to tell that? What does speedy trial mean? How do you determine that a jury was impartially selected? What's the effect of bearing arms if it means keeping the loaded guns in classroom? So only recently did the CDCP even employ statistics in the aid of reducing gun violence because they were prohibited by Congress from doing so. The reason you see someone here behind bars is because the death penalty in the United States can be shown to be statistically dependent upon the race of the victim. Also on the race of the defendant, but more so on the race of the victim. So there's clearly racial discrimination in the imposition of the death penalty in the United States. Not all states have the death penalty. The worst place in the most prominent place in the country is Harris County, Texas, but there are lots of states that don't have death penalties. But it's in all of the states you can find statistical evidence that there's discrimination in the selection of juries. Now, there have been some Supreme Court cases. For example, one case that I like a lot, it was decided that there had been discrimination. The black population had been unfairly kept away from voting in a particular county in Alabama. So what did they do? They decided to have a new way of doing this. They would write the names of the voters on pieces of paper, and they would put them in a very large crystal bowl, and then somebody would draw the names out of there. So that's what they did. However, they wrote the names of white people on white pieces of paper, and they wrote the names of black people on yellow pieces of paper. And guess what? When they drew the names out of this crystal bowl, there was discrimination in the eventual establishment of people to serve on the juries. So all sorts of things happen. Some of them are settled by the courts, some of them aren't. Now, there are 2 kinds of discrimination that we need to worry about. One's probably the kind that you're the most familiar with. This is called disparate treatment. You just didn't get a job because you were the wrong race or you were the wrong gender. You didn't get the job. Disparate impact is a requirement that, while it's neutral on its face, has an adverse impact on a protected category, like race or religion or gender. So for women and minority groups, for instance, a restrictive height requirement might have meant, for example, that I wouldn't have had a woman pilot on my last flight into Washington because she would have been less than the required height. That was settled by bringing a model cockpit into a courtroom to show that you really didn't need to be as tall as the airline was claiming, and that way more women got the jobs. The seminal case that established the concept of disparate impact involved whether or not you needed to be a high school graduate to put up power lines in the state of North Carolina. That requirement had been used to exclude black men. Before the Civil Rights Amendment and the Civil Rights Act came across, in the state of North Carolina, only white men were allowed to be established in the lines. Don't even think about women. We're talking about back in the 70s. Well, that became illegal, so the power company had to think of something new. So they decided, okay, to be a power lineman, to string these lines, you have to be a college graduate. Well, that had a disparate impact on the population of North Carolina, because the proportion of black men in North Carolina with high school diplomas was less than the proportion of white men with high school diplomas. So that was thrown out as being disparate impact, and they could no longer require people to have a high school diploma in order to hang up the lines. Now, we had a lot of statistics in that case, including statistics showing how many white men had in the past been hired to string up the lines without having a high school degree. So you had showing the result of the job as well as showing the disparate impact that it had. It's a good idea to try to work on different ways that you can deal with employment discrimination. There are lots of cases involving various things, but many of them simply involve the statistics. What can you show? What do the statistics show? Obviously, if you put in something like a minimum wage, that will have a non-adverse impact. A minimum wage has an adverse impact, but the adverse impact is not against women and minorities. In fact, it actually helps women and minorities. And that's not been generally accepted until a rather recent Nobel Prize in Economics that went to somebody who did some experimental economics, which in and of itself is rather unusual, and came up with support for establishing a minimum wage as one way to ensure more equality in pay. So we're talking about equal rights as one of the human rights. How equal is equal? Well, this dates back not only to the Constitution, but to a case in 1954, which is called Brown versus Board of Education. On the basis of voluminous statistics, the Supreme Court declared that separate can never be equal in the case of segregation by race in schools. Under a less restrictive standard, gender discrimination has been found to be unconstitutional. In particular, the Supreme Court found that alternative leadership courses were not equal to the programs in the Virginia Military Institute that denied females admission. In another case in which I was an expert witness, Philadelphia was unable to persuade the Pennsylvania court that offering Italian at Girls High was equal to offering Calculus 2 at Central High. So Central High got integrated on the basis of the testimony that you really needed calculus. Italian wouldn't do, or wouldn't be a good substitute. In another case, also in Pennsylvania, Temple University ran into trouble by having discrimination in what the athletic budgets were for men and women. And if you stick with a sport in which there are both kinds of teams, if you talk about football, you can see what's going to happen. But in Temple, the case was basketball. Why were they spending so much more money on basketball for men than on basketball for women? And so in testimony before the court, they looked at the ways that the sports department at Temple had reduced the cost of sports programs for women. And one way that they did it was, well, when they sent the women's teams out on trips, they put 3 women in a room, but when they sent the men out, they only put 2 men in a room. So obviously, they were going to save money by putting more women in a room. So the sports director of Temple was asked on the stand, why? Oh, he said, men are bigger. So obviously, that's a reason why you could only put 2 in and then you have 3 for them. Anyway, okay, so Title IX of the Civil Rights Act of 1972 deals with gender discrimination in colleges and universities and in public schools as well. And it is based almost entirely on the use of statistics. What is required by Title IX is that the participation and support of women in athletics be substantially proportionate to their presence in the student body. So obviously, you've got to know some statistics if you want to know what substantially proportionate means. So you could look around and ask at the University of Texas at Arlington, what percentage of the student body are women? And what percentage of your athletes are women? Good question. I don't know. But I do know what happened at Brown University, because I worked on that case as a statistician for a woman who was challenging what went on in Brown University. And the university got a good circuit court decision, and the Supreme Court didn't overrule it. unlike many things that they do overrule. So as a result of the Brown case, we sort of established that statistics was a way to see whether or not Title IX was followed with respect to participation in sports. Now, beyond what we often call civil rights in this country, there are the broader issues that are covered by many other places when we speak of human rights. The deprivation of personal security somewhere in the world. We see what's going on today in Ukraine, what's going on in Myanmar, what's going on in many countries, to the possible neglect of what's going on at home, here, through violence or oppression by authoritarian regimes in many parts of the world. We think about actions against individuals, like the murder of the journalist Khashoggi by the agents of Saudi Arabia, or, rather than individuals, against a class of people, sometimes the entire population, like the genocides through violent killing or starvation or displacement, or the suppression of women by the Taliban, or of minority groups elsewhere, or to those like Texas, where new laws deprive women of the command of their own bodies, or more urgent, the conditions faced by the people of Ukraine and others around the world living in poverty and oppression. Can statisticians do anything other than just document these atrocities? As I say, it's easy to talk, sometimes it's even easy to document, but it's hard to do something. Education and training, perhaps resettlement plans in some cases, provide the promise of better days for refugees. And there's a role there for us. In particular, of course, the status of women and human rights protection improve as women become significant wage earners. That's been proved in country after country. There's information available about the efforts of organizations, but of course you could ask what your employer or your friends or your colleagues are doing about providing employment for refugees, about providing ways for women to regain or to protect their human rights. Refugees are always with us. Refugees from Syria, Haiti, Myanmar, elsewhere are in the news currently. In many parts of the world that have not been a stranger to the widespread abuse of human rights. Often the treatment of refugees, once they've been gathered together, are not what it should be. Aside from what recent reports say have been happening on the Rio Grande, there's also been reports of abuse of refugees elsewhere. I was involved a few years ago in the work of an organization called Help Age to study the treatment of elderly among the refugee camps in Jordan, Kurdistan, Pakistan, Panama, Uganda. But think also of the refugees in Turkey, in the Balkans, the coast of the English Channel, Eastern Europe now today. After the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, founders of a group called Statistics Without Borders helped plan the recovery in Haiti, but surely they didn't anticipate that years later, the displacement of thousands of Haitians to South America and then to the US border and then back to the homeland, excuse me, now to a foreign locale, nor of the abductions occurring elsewhere. If I were at home, I would have to go out of the room to drink water. That's... I'll get you some of that. Okay, education's a human right, and much of my work in human rights has involved education. Relatively calm, one might think, to work in education, but I found that in my casework with Amnesty International for the Roma children in the Czech Republic, with Amadis, the American Middle East Educational Foundation in the Middle East and North Africa. My first dealing with an individual issue, rather than one involving quantities of people, involved the release of a mathematician from prison in Uruguay. Although his professional work was not the cause of his imprisonment, in the past and even now, I've been involved in cases where statisticians' work led to abuse of his or her human rights. In Argentina, in Greece, in Spain, in Russia, the ongoing problems over in, besides the war in Ukraine, not that they need anything else, include suppression of the press and the mass arrest of prisoners. Mathematicians were, before the evolution of the war Ukraine were working on a campaign to try to get a mathematician who's been in prison for a number of years and allegedly tortured out of prison. My involvement in human rights in Tunisia combined work for individuals as well as general education to try to improve education in Tunisia. We worked on trying to establish the notion of the use of community colleges to reach more people in various poverty levels throughout the country. But in addition, there was a Tunisian mathematician who had been periodically arrested. First he was a communist, and then he was a Muslim brother, and then maybe he was both, but he was in and out of prison a lot. But in one period of time between his sieges in prison, he came to work with my late husband as a mathematician at the University of Maryland. And so I got to know him because of that. Then, of course, when he went back to Tunisia, he ended up in prison again. But then the group of people, the Ennahda Party, took over government. And the next time I was in Tunisia, I was able to meet with him in his office because he was the Minister of Higher Education and Research. So sometimes things do turn out better than you sometimes think they might. Why the picture of the Washington Monument? What does it have to do with any of this? Well, when I met him in his office in Tunisia, he recalled that the thing that he remembered most about the stay of 3 months or so with my husband working on differential geometry was the night that the president at that time, happened to be President Reagan, was giving a State of the Union address. And I had the habit of taking visitors to Washington in the old days, around downtown Washington at night, and particular to the steps of the Capitol, where you could actually walk up to the Capitol, stand on the steps, and look out to the west and see the sun setting. So this is the sun setting from the steps of the Capitol. But it so happened that the night we were talking about was the night that President Reagan was giving a State of the Union speech, and so of course there was a procession of cars, which I managed to get in as we were driving around near the Capitol. And my Tunisian visitor was so impressed that I didn't get arrested for getting into the presidential procession. That's what he had remembered many years later. Okay, so I mentioned the International Women's Day at Eritrea. I almost didn't get into Eritrea because when I flew into Addis Ababa, I was flying on got a flight out of Addis Ababa to Asmara as a domestic flight, because this was the day before, or several days before, Eritrea became independent. So when I got on it in Addis Ababa, they told me it was domestic. When I landed in Asmara, it was an international flight, and I had no visa for the regionally established state of Eritrea. Now, I was saved by the fact that I could see the border control in the distance, and my student who had invited me to come could also see this, and the person who was giving me a hard time about getting into the country was his ex-student. So he persuaded him to let me in after all, and I managed to go down the next day and get my visa and celebrate with them International Women's Day. As I say, things are no longer in very good shape. Random is random. Those of you who've ever had any statistics courses or anything to do with lotteries, you know that random selection is very important in a lot of contexts. And in particular, it should play a substantial role in juries, a substantial role in how you choose people for prominent positions, lots of ways that it's important. Well, it's not always successful. I went to Rwanda after the genocide to select a sample of prisoners to begin the post-genocidal judicial proceedings. Why was this? Well, in a nation of 5 million people, over 800,000 had been imprisoned. And so you can see that the judicial system, along with everything else, was in disarray. So as people were arrested for having participated in the genocide, the prisons filled up. And then more prisons were built, and they filled up. And people were being sent to prison, and there was no way out other than by death. And the people who were providing support from Rwanda, post-genocide, to help restore the country, said, you know, speedy trial, we've got to have a speedy trial. Some of the people have to get out of prison and be tried. And we understand that you're short of courthouses even to hold the proceedings in, much less judges and attorneys and so on. So the idea was we would take a sample and we would start with this sample and we would see how we did with putting them on trial and providing the witnesses and whether or not we could have a good trial for the perpetrators or the alleged perpetrators of the Rwanda genocide. Well, the problem was I did go around the country and established a stratified random sample of prisoners. Problem is that it was a random sample. And we were supposed to start trials with that, but this random sample didn't include some of the favorite victims of the, favorite perpetrators of the victims. The people who had been most responsible for killing off people were not selected in this random sample. And the people who were running the government and had put them in prison were not happy with that, so we had to scrap the system of the random judgments. I also spent some time in Iraq. I mentioned the prisons there. I also I talk about lack of success. I tried to conduct a census in the city of Kirkuk, but it was impossible to calculate a census. Anybody who's ever done any sampling survey, anybody who's ever been involved in a survey to predict who's going to win the next election knows it's very important how you choose. You have to be able to choose the sample in such a way that it's going to reflect the population about which you're making a decision, whether it's voting for somebody or whether it's something else. Well, what we discovered in Kirkuk was it was impossible to do this because you couldn't send people from one faction into the other areas. And of course, if you only let people count their people from their own denominations, then you were going to get a biased sample in each case. So the Kurdish people wanted to interview the Kurds, the people with a classical Iraqi background, most of whom had been moved there by Saddam Hussein, and the Turkish or the Turkoman interest all had different ideas of how they were going to conduct the sample surveys, and we never were able to do a decent census that we could rely on in Iraq. And I'm going to end with a land for two people because I've spent a lot of time on human rights work in the occupied territory of the West Bank and Gaza. In fact, even the name of the destination, occupied territory, is a matter of bitter dispute. However, the fact remains that there's much to be done. My work's been largely in education, in the public schools, in the West Bank and Gaza, and in the universities, with some projects at least mildly successful. One time I found myself at a mathematics colloquium in Ramallah on the West Bank, surrounded by armed Israeli forces, since we were holding an unauthorized meeting in a YMCA building because the university was closed. Luckily, the president of the Palestinian University managed to persuade the colonel in charge that the colloquium on mathematics was not all that dangerous, and we were allowed to have our usual tea and cookies that mathematics colloquia have. And it could have been dangerous work, but that time we didn't get shot at. So be an observant or be a participant. Bring along your passion in human rights work. You can decide on what you want to work, who should engage your efforts. There is sometimes a specific topic, sometimes a specific area of the world. Sometimes the right you believe in might actually be harming somebody else. On the other hand, some of the applications of statistics to human rights are as simple as a bar chart. I don't know whether any of you remember or know of Florence Knight's work in statistics. Most people think of Florence Nightingale as a nurse who established the nursing profession on a standard in the United Kingdom. But she was also known for creating a way of representing the difference in fatalities that occurred on the battlefield versus the fatalities that occur once you got people into the hospitals where no proper standards were followed. And so you can see there, this is a depiction where the center is the few battlefield fatalities and the larger part of the rows is what happened after they got the people into the hospitals. As a lawyer, as I say, I went to law school. I'm a bona fide lawyer. As a lawyer, I have what we call a pro bono obligation. Pro bono is to work for the public good. Every lawyer is supposed to do this. I'd like to see statisticians and others with skills, engineers, psychologists, historians, have the same pro bono responsibility. Provide much needed help on human rights and social justice issues. These need your passion. Thank you again.